The year is 73 BCE, and beneath the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus makes a decision that will shake the Roman Republic to its core. But this isn't just the story of one man's rebellion. This is the story of the invisible engine that powered the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen. An economy built on the backs of millions who had no choice, no freedom, and often no names that history would remember. Imagine walking through the streets of Rome at its height. The marble gleams white in the Mediterranean sun. Aqueducts carry fresh water from distant mountains. The Colosseum rises like a monument to human achievement. Senators debate philosophy in togas, while merchants haggle over exotic goods from 3 continents. But look closer. For every free Roman citizen you see, there are 2 or 3 others moving through the crowds, heads slightly bowed, performing tasks both menial and sophisticated. These are the slaves, and without them, the entire magnificent edifice of Roman civilization would collapse overnight. The scale of Roman slavery defies modern comprehension. By the 1st century CE, approximately 1/3 of the population of the Italian peninsula were enslaved. In the city of Rome itself, the proportion was even higher, perhaps approaching 40%. We're talking about 2 to 3 million people in Italy alone, with millions more across the empire's vast territories. This wasn't a marginal institution or a moral failing on the edges of society. Slavery was the beating heart of the Roman economic system, as fundamental to their world as electricity is to ours. But here's what makes the Roman slave system so economically distinctive and so chillingly efficient. It wasn't based on race or ethnicity. Anyone could become a slave. You could be a fair-skinned Gaul, a dark-skinned Nubian, a Greek scholar, or a Germanic warrior. What mattered wasn't the color of your skin, but the misfortune of your circumstances. The primary source of slaves was war, and Rome was always at war. Every military campaign brought fresh waves of captives. When Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, he enslaved an estimated 1 million people. When Titus sacked Jerusalem in 70 CE, 97,000 Jews were reportedly enslaved. The machinery of Roman expansion was simultaneously a machinery of enslavement. The economic mathematics were brutally simple. A successful military campaign didn't just expand territory, it provided immediate returns on investment in the form of human capital that could be sold, traded, or put to work. Slave markets existed in every major city, with the largest in Delos reportedly capable of processing 10,000 people per day during peak periods. Prices varied enormously based on age, skills, and physical condition. An unskilled agricultural laborer might sell for the equivalent of several months of a soldier's wages, while a highly educated Greek tutor or a skilled physician could command prices 20 times higher. Some slaves, those with rare technical expertise or extraordinary beauty, could cost as much as a small estate. Now let's talk about where these millions of people actually worked. Because the Roman slave economy was far more complex than the Hollywood image of muscular men building pyramids under whips. Agriculture was certainly the foundation. Vast estates called latifundia stretched across Sicily, North Africa, and southern Italy, producing grain, wine, and olive oil that fed the empire. These weren't small family farms. We're talking about industrial-scale operations, some employing hundreds or even thousands of slaves working the fields, tending livestock, operating olive presses and wine production facilities. The profit margins were enormous because labor costs were essentially limited to basic subsistence, food, minimal shelter, and occasional replacement of workers who died or became unable to work. But the truly fascinating aspect of the Roman slave economy was its sophistication in urban settings. Walk into a wealthy Roman household and you'd encounter an elaborate hierarchy of enslaved workers, each with specialized roles. There were cooks, cleaners, doorkeepers, litter bearers, hairdressers, entertainers, teachers for the children, secretaries, accountants, and personal attendants. Some elite households had staffs of hundreds. The emperor's household, the Familia Caesaris, employed thousands of slaves in roles ranging from menial labor to high-level administration of imperial properties and finances. Here's where it gets really interesting from an economic perspective. Many skilled slaves operated with remarkable autonomy. Enslaved doctors treated patients throughout the city. Enslaved architects designed buildings. Enslaved bankers managed financial transactions. There were enslaved shop managers, ship captains, and business agents who conducted complex commercial operations on behalf of their owners. The Romans developed a sophisticated legal and economic framework called the peculium, which allowed slaves to hold and manage property, conduct business, and even own other slaves themselves, all technically belonging to their master but functionally operated independently. This created a strange economic paradox. Some slaves, particularly those working in commerce or imperial administration, lived better than many free poor citizens. They had nicer clothes, better food, more education, and greater economic security. Yet they remained property, subject to their owner's absolute power, unable to make truly independent choices about their lives, always one transaction away from being sold to a worse situation. An enslaved imperial secretary might advise the emperor on financial policy in the morning and be sold to a mine owner in the afternoon if he displeased someone powerful enough. The mining and quarrying operations reveal the darkest side of this economy. Slaves sent to the mines in Spain, where Rome extracted vast quantities of silver, or to the quarries of Egypt, faced conditions of almost unimaginable brutality. Life expectancy in the mines might be measured in months rather than years. Workers labored in darkness, breathing toxic dust, with minimal food and no medical care. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, but economic calculation. The mines were so profitable and the supply of new slaves so reliable that it made financial sense to literally work people to death and replace them. The silver that funded Rome's military expansion and backed its currency was extracted at a human cost we can barely fathom. Manufacturing operations relied heavily on enslaved labor as well. Pottery workshops, textile production facilities, metalworking shops, and construction operations all utilized predominantly slave workforces. The famous Roman concrete, which still stands 2,000 years later, was mixed and laid by enslaved workers. The roads that connected the empire, the aqueducts that brought water, the public buildings that symbolized Roman power, all were built primarily by people who had no freedom and received no wages beyond survival rations. The economic efficiency of slavery created what we might call a development trap. Why invest in labor-saving technology when human labor is so cheap? Why develop better agricultural techniques when you can just throw more workers at the problem? Some historians argue that the abundance of slave labor actually retarded technological development in the Roman world. There were brilliant inventors and engineers in ancient Rome, but their innovations rarely spread widely because there was no economic incentive to adopt them. The water wheel existed but wasn't widely deployed. Mechanical devices were treated as curiosities rather than practical tools. Human muscles, controlled by slave labor, remained the primary power source for almost everything. But slaves weren't passive victims in this system. Resistance took many forms, from subtle sabotage to outright rebellion. Agricultural slaves might work slowly, damage tools, or poison livestock. Urban slaves might steal, run away, or in extreme cases, murder their owners. The Romans lived in constant low-level fear of slave uprisings, and that fear was justified. The three great servile wars, particularly the revolt led by Spartacus from 73 to 71 BCE, demonstrated what could happen when enslaved people organized and fought back. Spartacus's army grew to perhaps 70,000, defeated multiple Roman legions, and rampaged through Italy for 2 years before finally being crushed. 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way from Capua to Rome, a warning visible for miles that stretched for over 100 miles. The economic impact of such rebellions was devastating but temporary. The larger threat to the slave economy came from changing military circumstances. As Roman expansion slowed in the 2nd century CE, the supply of new slaves from military conquests began to dwindle. The price of slaves rose. Landowners began to shift toward a different labor model, settling slaves on small plots of land as tenant farmers called colony. These workers weren't free, but they weren't exactly slaves either. They were tied to the land, required to hand over a portion of their production, but they could form families, maintain some property, and had slightly more security. This system, which we might call proto-feudalism, would eventually evolve into the medieval manor system. The economic role of slavery also created profound political consequences. The importation of millions of enslaved workers displaced free peasant farmers who couldn't compete with estate agriculture using free labor. These displaced farmers flooded into Rome, creating a large urban population of poor citizens with no productive employment. The Roman state responded with grain subsidies and public entertainment, the famous bread and circuses, but this created a vicious cycle. The elite got richer from slave work to states, paid for the subsidies, and gained political power from their wealth. The poor citizens depended on handouts and entertainment. The slaves had no political voice at all. This unstable arrangement contributed to the collapse of the Roman Republic and the rise of the emperors. We should also talk about manumission, the process by which slaves could gain freedom, because this was another unique economic feature of the Roman system. Unlike later slave systems in the Americas, Romans regularly freed slaves, sometimes in their wills, sometimes as rewards for loyal service, sometimes in exchange for payment from the slave's peculium. Freed slaves, called liberti or freedmen, became Roman citizens with some restrictions. Their children would be full citizens. This created an economic pathway that was simultaneously a release valve for the system and a form of social control. If you worked hard, served loyally, and got lucky, you might someday be free. This hope, however slim, helped maintain order. Many of the wealthiest merchants and businessmen in the late Republic and early Empire were freedmen or their descendants. The intimate connection between the elite and their slaves created complicated social dynamics. Your pedagogue who taught you Greek, your secretary who managed your correspondence, your steward who ran your estate. These were people you interacted with daily, who knew your secrets, who raised your children. They were also your property, subject to your whims, legally available for your sexual use, punishable at your discretion. The contradiction between the intimacy of these relationships and the absolute power dynamic must have created psychological tensions that our sources only occasionally reveal. By the 3rd century CE, the Roman economy was transforming. The combination of reduced slave supplies, military pressures on the frontiers, political instability, and plague reduced both the population and the economic vitality of the empire. The great slave-worked estates gave way to smaller holdings worked by semi-free colony. Long-distance trade declined. Cities shrank. The economic system that had depended on a constant influx of enslaved workers from conquest was no longer sustainable. Christianity's spread, with its theoretical emphasis on the equality of souls, didn't end slavery, but did begin to change attitudes very slowly. The institution would persist throughout the Middle Ages and into the modern era, but it would never again reach the economic centrality it had in the Roman world. What can we learn from this dark chapter of economic history? Perhaps that prosperity built on the denial of human freedom is ultimately unstable. The Roman elite enjoyed lives of luxury and leisure unmatched in the ancient world, but they built that comfort on a foundation of human suffering so vast that it ultimately corrupted their entire society. They created an economic system that was efficient in the short term, but that prevented technological development, displaced free workers, required constant military expansion, and created social tensions that contributed to political collapse. The marble monuments still standing across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East are testaments to human achievement, but they're also monuments to millions of people who had no choice but to build someone else's dreams while living nightmares of their own.